The power of horror, parasites and perverts. In Gothic, as in many areas of Victorian culture, sexual material was not repressed but produced on a massive scale, as Michel Foucault has argued. The narrative, then, that professed outrage at acts of sexual perversion, the nightly wanderings of Hyde, for example, or Dracula's midnight feasts, in fact produced a catalogue of perverse sexuality by first showcasing the temptations of the flesh in glorious technicolor, and then by depicting so-called normal sex as a sickly enterprise devoid of all passion. One has only to think of the contrast between Mina Harker's encounter with Count Dracula. She is found lapping at blood from his breast, and her sexually neutral maternal relations with her husband. The production of sexuality as identity, and as the inversion of identity, perversion, a turning away from identity, in Gothic novels consolidates normal sexuality by defining it in contrast to its monstrous manifestations. Horror, I have suggested, exercises power even as it incites pleasure and or disgust. Horror, indeed, has a power closely related to its pleasure-producing function, and the twin mechanism of pleasure-power perhaps explains how it is that Gothic may empower some readers even as it disables others. An example of how Gothic appeals differently to different readers may be found in contemporary slasher movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, and Halloween, 1978. Critics generally argue that these films inspire potency in a male viewer and incredible vulnerability in a female viewer. However, as we shall see in the later chapters of this book, the mechanisms of Gothic narrative never turn so neatly around gender identifications. A male viewer of the slasher film, like a male reader of the 19th century 1800s Gothic, may find himself on the receiving end of countless acts of degradation in relation to monstrosity and its powers, while the female reader and spectator may be able to access a surprising source of power through monstrous forms and monstrous genres. In her psychoanalytic study of fear, Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva defines horror in terms of abjection. The abject, she writes, is something rejected from which one does not part, from which one does not protect oneself as from an object. Imaginary uncanniness and real threat, it beckons to us and ends up engulfing us. In a chapter on the writings of Celine, Kristeva goes on to identify abjection with the Jew of anti-Semitic discourse. Anti-Semitic fantasy, she suggests, elevates Jewishness to both mastery and weakness, to sex tinged with femininity and death. The Jew, for Kristeva, anchors abjection within a body, a foreign body that retains a certain familiarity and that therefore confuses the boundary between self and other. The connection that Kristeva makes between psychological categories and socio-political processes leads her to claim that anti-Semitism functions as a receptacle for all kinds of fears, sexual, political, national, cultural, economic. This insight is important to the kinds of arguments that I am making about the economic function of the Gothic monster. The Jew in general within anti-Semitism is Gothicized or transformed into a figure of almost universal loathing who haunts the community and represents its worst fears. By making the Jew supernatural, Gothic anti-Semitism actually makes Jews into spooks and Jew-hating into a psychological inevitability. The power of literary horror, indeed, lies in its ability to transform political struggles into psychological conditions and then to blur the distinction between the two. Literary horror, or Gothic, I suggest, uses the language of race hatred, most obviously anti-Semitism, to characterize monstrosity as a representation of psychological disorder. To understand the way monster may be equated with Jew or foreigner, or non-English national, we need to historicize Gothic metaphors like vampire and parasite. We also have to read the effacement of the connection between monster and foreigner, alongside the articulation of monster as a sexual category. The return of the repressed. In an introduction to studies on hysteria written in 1893, Freud identifies the repressed self as a foreign body. Noting that hysterical symptoms replay some original trauma in response to an accident, Freud explains that the memory of trauma acts like a foreign body which, long after its entry, must continue to be regarded as an agent that is still at work. In other words, until an original site of trauma reveals itself in therapy, it remains foreign to body and mind but active in both. The repressed, then, figures as a sexual secret that the body keeps from itself, and it figures as foreign because what disturbs the body goes unrecognized by the mind. The fiction that Freud tells about the foreign body as the repressed connects remarkably with the fiction Gothic tells about monsters as foreigners. Texts, like bodies, store up memories of past fears, of distant traumas. Hysterics, writes Freud, suffer mainly from reminiscences. History, personal and social, haunts hysterics, and the repressed always takes on an uncanny life of its own. Freud here has described the landscape of his own science. Foreignness is repressed into the depths of an unconscious, a kind of cesspool of forgotten memories, and it rises to the surface as a sexual disturbance. Psychoanalysis gothicizes sexuality, that is to say, it creates a body haunted by a monstrous sexuality and forced into repressing its gothic secrets. Psychoanalysis, in the Freudian scenario, is a sexual science able to account for and perhaps cure gothic sexualities. Gothicization in this formula, then, is the identification of bodies in terms of what they are not. A gothic other stabilizes sameness. A gothicized body is one that disrupts the surface-depth relationship between the body and the mind. It is the body that must be spoken, identified, or eliminated. Eve Sedgwick has advanced a reading of Gothic as the return of the repressed. This was literally based on Freud's work. She reads fear in the Gothic in terms of the trope of live burial, and finds in Gothic a carceral sublime of representation, of the body, and potentially of politics and history as well. Live burial as a trope is, of course, standard fare in the Gothic, particularly in 18th century Gothic, 1700s, like Matthew Lewis's The Monk and Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. Live burial also works nicely as a metaphor for a repressed thing that threatens to return. Sedgwick's example of the repressed in Gothic is homosexuality. She characterizes the paranoid Gothic novel in terms of its thematization of homophobia, and thus she describes Frankenstein's plot in terms of a tableau of two men chasing each other across the landscape. But Sedgwick's reading tells only half the story. The sexual outsider in Gothic, I am suggesting, is always also a racial pariah, a national outcast, a class outlaw. The carceral sublime of representation that, for Sedgwick, marks the role of textuality or language in the production of fear does not only symbolize that Gothic language buries fear alive. Live burial is certainly a major and standard trope of Gothic, but I want to read it alongside the trope of parasitism. Parasitism, I think, adds an economic dimension to live burial that reveals the entanglement of capital, nation, and the body in the fictions of otherness sanctified and popularized by any given culture. If live burial, for Sedgwick, reveals a queerness of meaning, an essential doubleness within language that plays itself out through homoerotic doubles within the text, the carceral in my reading hinges upon a more clearly metonymic structure. Live burial, as parasitism then, becomes a tooth buried in an exposed neck for the explicit purpose of bloodsucking, or a monstrous hide hidden within the very flesh of a respectable Jekyll. Live burial is the entanglement of self and other within monstrosity and the parasitical relationship between the two. The one is always buried in the other. The form of the Gothic novel, again as Sedgwick remarks, reflects further upon the parasitical monstrosity it creates. The story buried within a story, buried within a story, that Shelley's Frankenstein popularizes evolves into the narrative with one story but many different tellers. This form is really established by Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, 1860. In this novel, Collins uses a series of narrators so that almost every character in the novel tells his or her side of the story. Such a narrative device gives the effect of completion and operates according to a kind of judicial model of narration, where all witnesses step forward to give an account. Within this narrative system, the author professes to be no more than a collector of documents, a compiler of the facts of the case. The reader, of course, is the judge and jury, the courtroom audience, and often, a kind of prosecuting presence expected to know truth, recognize guilt, and penalize monstrosity. In Dracula, Bram Stoker directly copies Collins's style. Stevenson also uses Collins's narrative technique in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but he frames his story in a more overtly legal setting, so that our main narrator is a lawyer, the central document is the last will and testament of Dr. Jekyll, and all other accounts contribute to the strange case. All Gothic novels employing this narrative device share an almost obsessive concern with documentation, and they all exhibit a sinister mistrust of the not said, the unspoken, the hidden, and the silent. Furthermore, most Gothic novels lack the point of view of the monster. Collins does include in his novel a chapter by the notorious Count Fosco, but Fosco's account is written as a forced confession that confirms his guilt and reveals his machinations. Neither Dracula nor Dorian Gray ever directly give their versions of events, and Jekyll stands in at all times for his monstrous double Hyde. Collins's novel is extremely important to the Victorian Gothic tradition in that it establishes a layered narrative structure. in which a story must be peeled back to reveal the secret or repressed center. The secret buried in the heart of Gothic, I suggested much earlier, is usually identified as a sexual secret. In an essay on the function of sensationalism in The Woman in White, Anne Svetkovich argues that the sexual secret in this novel ultimately has little to do with a random sexual desire, and everything to do with the class structure that brings Walter Hartwright into contact with his future bride, Laura Fairley. Svetkovich suggests that the novel, in fact, sensationalizes class relations by making the relationship between Laura and her lowly art teacher seem fateful, preordained rather than a product of one man's social ambition. Novels in a Gothic mode transform class and race, sexual and national relations into supernatural or monstrous features. The threat posed by the Gothic monster is a combination of money, science, perversion, and imperialism, but by reducing it to solely sexual aberrance, we fail to historicize Gothic embodiments. The technology of monsters. This book will argue that Gothic novels are technologies that produce the monster as a remarkably mobile, permeable, and infinitely interpretable body. The monster's body, indeed, is a machine that, in its Gothic mode, produces meaning and can represent any horrible trait that the reader feeds into the narrative. The monster functions as monster, in other words, when it is able to condense as many fear-producing traits as possible into one body. Hence the sense that Frankenstein's monster is bursting out of his skin. He is indeed filled to bursting point with flesh and meaning both. Dracula, at the other end of the 19th century, 1800s, is a body that consumes to excess. The vampiric body in its ideal state is a bloated body, sated with the blood of its victims. Monsters are meaning machines. They can represent gender, race, nationality, class, and sexuality in one body. And even within these divisions of identity, the monster can still be broken down. Dracula, for example, can be read as aristocrat, a symbol of the masses. He is predator and yet feminine. He is consumer and producer. He is parasite and host. He is homosexual and heterosexual. He is even a lesbian. Monsters in the Gothic fiction that creates them are therefore technologies, narrative technologies that produce the perfect figure for negative identity. Monsters have to be everything the human is not, and, in producing the negative of human, these novels make way for the invention of human as white, male, middle class, and heterosexual. But Gothic is also a narrative technique, a generic spin that transforms the lovely and the beautiful into the aberrant, and then frames this transformation within a humanist moral fable. A brilliant postmodern example of what happens when a narrative is Gothicized is Tim Burton's surrealistic Nightmare Before Christmas. Nightmare is an animated fantasy about what happens when Halloween takes over Christmas. Halloween and Christmas in this film are conceived as places rather than times or occasions, and they each are embodied by their festive representatives, Jack Skellington and Santa Claus. Indeed, religious or superstitious meanings of these holidays are almost entirely absent from the plot. Jack Skellington is a kind of melancholic romantic hero who languishes under the strain of representing fear and maintaining the machinery of horror every year. He stumbles upon the place called Christmas one day after a stroll through the woods beyond his graveyard, and he decides that he wants to do Christmas this year instead of Halloween. The transformation of Christmas into Halloween is the Gothicization of the sentimental. Presents and toys, food and decorations are all transformed from cheery icons of goodwill into fanged monsters, death masks, and all manner of skullduggery. Kids are frightened, parents are shocked, Santa Claus is kidnapped, and mayhem ensues. Of course, a pathetic, sentimental heroine called Sally uses her ragdoll body to restore law and order, and to woo Jack back to his proper place, but nonetheless, the damage has been done. Christmas, the myth of a transcendent generosity, goodwill, and community love, has been unmasked as just another consumer ritual, and its icons have been exposed as simply toys without teeth, or masks that smile instead of grimace. The naturalness and goodness of Christmas has unraveled and shown itself to be the easy target of any and all attempts to make it Gothic. While Nightmare suggests that, at least in a postmodern setting, Gothicization seems to have progressive and even radicalizing effects, it is not always so simple to tell whether the presence of Gothic registers a conservative or a progressive move. Of course, Gothic is, as I have been arguing, mobile, and therefore, we should not expect it to succumb so easily to attempts to make a claim for its political investments, but it does seem as if there has been a transformation in the uses of Gothic from the early 19th century, 1800s, to the present. The second part of my study attempts to read the contemporary horror film in order to argue that horror now disrupts dominant culture's representations of family, heterosexuality, ethnicity, and class politics. It disrupts, furthermore, the logic of genre that essentializes generic categories and stabilizes the production of meaning within them. Gothic film horror, I propose, produces models of reading, many in any one location, that allow for multiple interpretations and a plurality of locations of cultural resistance. In this study, I am using terms like Gothic and technology very specifically. Gothic has typically been used to refer to two sets of novels. First, to refer to Gothic revival novels of the late 18th century, 1700s, and then second, to refer to a cluster of fin de siècle novels in England. Obviously, this study is more concerned with the latter group, but I am not simply using Gothic as a generic organizing term. Gothic, I will be arguing, is the breakdown of genre and the crisis occasioned by the inability to tell, meaning both the inability to narrate and the inability to categorize. Gothic, I argue, marks a peculiarly modern preoccupation with boundaries and their collapse. Gothic monsters, furthermore, differ from the monsters that come before the 19th century 1800s, in that the monsters of modernity are characterized by their proximity to humans. This book follows Gothic monstrosity through its various incarnations in fiction and film and across 2 centuries. In Chapter 2, Making Monsters, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I read Frankenstein as an allegory of the history of the novel. Mary Shelley, I argue, produces a totalizing monster who defines the cultural and symbolic functions of monstrosity. This monster signifies an array of societal, political, and sexual threats and must be read as a textual technology and a Gothic history of narrative itself. In the next chapter, on the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the picture of Dorian Gray, I examine these 2 Gothic texts as inversions of each other, which both produce a model of human subjectivity predicated on a topology of surface and depth. Hyde is hidden within Jekyll, and Dorian Gray's picture takes upon its own surface the traces of his debauched life. In each case, inner and outer identities are layered over each other to produce the effects of humanity, perversity, racial impurity, and degeneration. My 4th chapter, on Bram Stoker's Dracula, understands Dracula to be a cornerstone of Gothic writing, in that it produces another totalizing monster, a brother to Frankenstein's monster, who represents the fate of anarchic consumption. In my reading of the vampire's particular brand of monstrosity, I comment upon the peculiar consistencies between the Gothic vampire and the anti-Semite's Jew. The second half of Skin Shows begins to trace Gothic monstrosity into the 20th century, 1900s, and into contemporary horror film. I use psychoanalysis in Chapter 5 in order to bridge the gap between 19th, 1800s, and 20th, 1900s century conceptions of monstrosity, fear, and horror. In keeping with my claim throughout that fear and monstrosity are historically specific forms rather than psychological universals, I try to account for a switch in emphasis within the representation and interpretation of monstrous bodies from class, race, and nationality to a primary focus upon sexuality and gender. In large part, this narrowing down of monstrous features to monstrous sex and gender has to do with the success of the hegemonic installation of psychoanalytic interpretations of human subjectivity, which understands subjectivity as sexual subjectivity and identity as sexual identity, and monstrosity as sexual pathology. Freud's case histories of paranoia illustrate well the psychoanalytic fictions of fear and loathing, which tend to revolve around a rather homophobic insistence on paranoia as fear of homosexual desire. I conclude this chapter by reading Freud's case of paranoia in A Woman Against the Grain and arguing for a productive site of inquiry into fear through female paranoia that may produce feminist readings of horror. To demonstrate the effects of a psychoanalytic account of horror and fear, I graphed my analysis of Freud's case history of paranoia in a woman onto Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. It becomes clear immediately that the cinematic monstrosity of The Birds represents something very different and functions differently than the textual horror of Frankenstein's monster and Dracula. As we will see in relation to postmodern horror film, the postmodern era does not offer any totalizing monsters, and meaning refuses to coalesce within one hideous body. The birds themselves in Hitchcock's film are a good example of the transference of horror from a specifically unnatural body to nature itself, embodied within the myriad form of a flock of aggressive birds. The horror genre itself, as it moves from book to cinema, from word to image, shatters into many pieces, and every horror film simultaneously creates the genre anew and conforms loosely to the conventions of a subgenre.